what I call the lunatic fringe, still clings to the notion that there was a gigantic governmental conspiracy that brought about this nightmare. It is difficult to see how any rational human being subscribes to such a notion, but obviously many do. What I am telling you is that the most plausible single explanation for this nightmare, namely the apocalyptic vision of a criminally insane, charismatic cult leader who was hell-bent on bringing about this infernal nightmare in flames and the extermination of the children and the women and the other innocents, is not an explanation that should be cast aside.
Revelation states that Christ has the key of David. Only he can open and none can shut. There's 150 Psalms here. Some people find it amazing that I know every one of them.
Vernon Howell thinks he's the Lamb of God, when all he is a cheap thug who interprets the Bible through the barrel of a gun. Now they're making self-serving statements that ATF opened fire on
there was an element in the press conferences every day to demonize David, and it was through the language, cult leader David Koresh and compound and bunker, and militarize the situation so that nothing ever positive came out. There was never any sense of telling the public, well, who are these people?
I'm Paulina.
I'm Stephen.
I'm Vanessa.
Well, you had a bunch of women, children, elderly people. They were all good people. They had different beliefs from others, different beliefs than I have, or maybe different beliefs than you have in their way of life, and especially in their religious beliefs. But basically, they were good people. I was around them quite a lot. They were always nice, mannerly. They minded their own business. They were never overbearing. They were always clean and courteous. I liked them.
And what brings you all the way from England, a nice, lovely home of which I've seen and been in, what brings you to America, to a place called Waco, Texas, or Waco, Texas? Anybody want to speak first?
I've always wanted to know, to understand the Bible, and I wanted to know about the 7 seals, and I met somebody who can show me the 7 seals. I have my pastors, my ministers. I was a former Seventh-day Adventist. Nobody could show me, and now I found what I've been looking for.
The home video shown throughout this film is the only record of the Davidians during the 51-day siege. It was made because the FBI gave them a camera and asked them to talk about themselves.
We're going to be just fine because God's in control.
The FBI showed those tapes to no one, and in its report admits that it did not do that because it thought that those tapes would have won sympathy for Koresh.
Of course, the public heard of David Koresh in February of '93, but the history of the group goes back for about 50 years, long before David Koresh was even born. The Branch Davidians are a break-off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Advent meaning the second coming of Jesus. The Davidians, starting with a man by the name of Victor Hotep in the 1930s and 40s, believed that God had once again visited his people with a living prophet. That's the key.
Victor Hotep claimed to be that living prophet and moved his followers to Waco, Texas from Southern California during the 1930s. Living outside town in cottages, the Davidians studied the Bible as literal truth. The book of Revelation and its cryptic 7 seals was their focus. Christians generally believe the seals tell God's planned sequence of events leading to Judgment Day, and that their true meaning can only be explained by the Lamb of God, a Messiah who will come during the last days. 5 years after Hotep's death in 1954, all Davidians gathered at Mount Carmel. They believed Armageddon, the Bible's predicted final battle between good and evil, was close.
We feel that world conditions
conditions are such, in line with prophecy, that all nations are soon to gather against Jerusalem to battle. In fact, we expect that to be this spring.
The Davidian church almost disappeared after that. But Ben and Lois Roden kept a small group together. Lois led the Davidians after her husband died, and it was she who tutored young Vernon Howell as her understudy. When Lois Roden died, a leadership conflict between Howell and her son George, dubbed the Mad Man of Waco, split the Davidians.
So Holy Jihad, it's what you have with Khomeini against Israel. You've got a Vernon Howell against me.
The majority backed Howell. When George chased them off at gunpoint, Howell and his followers moved to Palestine, Texas, where they lived together in buses and tents. After an armed confrontation between the two rivals, Vernon Howell became the new Davidian leader. George Roden was later convicted of murder in an unrelated matter. During a pilgrimage to Israel, Howell believed God chose him to be a contemporary Cyrus and free God's chosen people, just as the ancient Persian king Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians and freed the captive Jews. On returning to the United States, he legally changed his first name to David, honoring the Hebrew King David, and his last name to Koresh, after the Messiah Koresh mentioned in the book of Isaiah. Koresh is the Hebrew word for Cyrus.
What he essentially claimed was not to be God or not to be Jesus Christ. The Davidians believe that Jesus Christ is in heaven and they are Christian in the broad sense. But he claimed to be a final Christ figure, an anointed one. The word Christ really doesn't refer just to Jesus, but it means somebody that's chosen or sent or anointed. He claimed to be that final one that's mentioned in the book of Revelation, the seventh messenger, the final messenger that's to come. And he also found himself prophesied throughout the Hebrew scriptures, but particularly the book of Isaiah and many of the Psalms, in very detailed ways. And he would go through the scriptures and find the references to a sinful Messiah. And he says, "My sins are more than the hairs of my head." Who could this be?
Oh, this time, when Christ reveals himself, it's going to be according to the book. Because there's some statements in there that might make you a little bit happy. Okay? Such as the rest of Psalms 40. Lord, I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. What's he going to preach? 7 seals.
In fact, the sinful Messiah phrase got picked up by the Waco Tribune Herald and pushed in the wrong direction. The claim of Koresh and his followers was not go out and deliberately sin, but unlike Christ, this one will not be without sin. He'll be an ordinary human being who does sin.
Attracted by Koresh's biblical teachings, new members increased the Davidians' numbers. In 1991, they recycled the lumber from the cottages and built the communal church that became familiar during the siege. As a multiracial congregation of all ages from around the world, residents contributed both their labor and money earned by work around Waco to support the spiritual life of Mount Carmel.
Things about the group that I guess created the most sensation would be the reported sexual irregularities, polygamy, and so forth. Underage women marrying David, and the arms.
It makes nobody's business whether we have a gun or not at this place. Guns are the right of Americans to have. Our government's the greatest in the world. We have freedom, not freedom for religion, not freedom for state, but freedom for all, you see? And that's what a lot of people don't understand.
What he usually quoted is a scripture from Jesus on the night of his arrest, where Jesus did not resist. Jesus says, from now on, let him who has no sword buy one.
Did King David have swords? Did Jesus tell the apostles to carry a sword with you? Yes.
In other words, say, get ready for the future.
This is for the little children, right? God knows how it should be. Stars and stripes are flying, give us justice and liberty for the children's sake. You know, you might have to bear a gun one day.
Now, how does that translate into, say, the communal living even the sexual arrangements of the group. It's still textually based. At the time of the end, those who have wives should live as though they have none. That's a teaching in the New Testament, and it explains the whole Catholic teaching on celibacy.
You see this here? Hey, this is my family. It may not be like your family.
Now, David Koresh himself obviously is not living the celibate life.
The family that you just showed that is yours, is that family mentioned in the scriptures? Anything to do with the seven seals?
Steve, you answer that. Y'all answer that. I mean, is my great, wonderful looks something that just women can't resist? Huh?
It has everything to do with the seals.
It has everything to do with the seals, you know?
Despite all the sneers and snickers that would cause on the part of the public, what they believed is that although celibacy is the way for the group, that this figure, this final figure, has the obligation to beget 24 children. And he has multiple wives. It's in prophecy, in other words. Might have been convenient, but this is what they found.
A lot of beliefs people have may seem abnormal or strange to other people. That doesn't mean that it's not right, though.
And these 24 children are to become the 24 elders that are to rule the earth. And they found these various prophecies. He would have claimed, and did claim, that this was nothing to do with sensuality or sexual desire. Essentially, it was for procreation. And he believed that these children, through these selected wives, would be pure. And like no children ever born, they're the beginning of the new Eden.
You know, our children know how to respect, they know how to be mindful, they know how to do right because they see it here. They see it in the parents. We subject ourselves to God. We're obedient unto God. We follow the pattern that God would have us to do.
They would be raised completely in the community. They would have never eaten even the diet of the world, the defiled world out there. Never watched TV, never participated in all the things that he saw as a corruption of the culture. That's how they would explain it.
I think that all you who got kids in the supermarkets who run and scream and who eat all this junk food all the time and all this candy, I think if you look at the children, you'll see the actual product of a parent.
After the Waco disaster, Alan Stone, a Harvard professor of both law and psychiatry, was asked to serve on a United States Department of Justice panel examining law enforcement policy toward unconventional groups like the Branch Davidians and leaders like David Koresh.
I think Koresh was not a criminal psychopathic type. He had, as a youngster, spent months memorizing the Bible, and particularly these particular passages about the seven seals. And that sort of repetitive study, memorization, throwing yourself into that kind of disciplined project is not what sociopaths do. And he was able to convince the other people by his knowledge of the Bible and the way he put it together. That's how he convinced people like Mr. Martin and Mr. Schneider, who were both intelligent, serious people. Mr. Martin was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He was one of our earliest African-American graduates. He was certainly not a weirdo. He was certainly not a criminal. He was certainly not a psychopath. He had gone on and done further religious studies after leaving Harvard Law School and had become interested in Koresh's teachings. That is how he got into the compound. So the idea that these people like Schneider and Martin were somehow criminal types or people who had just been sort of buffaloed by Koresh, I think, is the most unfortunate mischaracterization.
In contrast to somebody, though, like Jim Jones of the Jonestown disaster, Koresh did not really exercise this stunning, spellbinding, mesmerizing, stare you down sort of approach. Nobody, you talk to the Davidians that have survived, none of them come out talking about, oh, boy, when David spoke, I just felt like, it was God. That isn't how they talk. They don't even have that sort of pious feeling about it.
Why do the heathen rage? What's their problem? And the people imagine a vain thing. What are they thinking? Their thoughts are make-believe. Well, it's a vanity. Their thoughts are vain.
I mean nothing to myself. I want to know what truth is, and I'm searching for it. If he happens to be the vehicle that shows me, I thank God for him.
I think he's great.
Is he the Son of God?
I hope he is.
Who are the reporters who have covered this story?
First of all, I want to say thanks for reading my book.
Well, you're welcome.
Always glad
It's my
to meet
job.
someone who does. The biggest surprise I encountered in writing this book is that I had no competitors. And naturally, my conclusions differ, or my questions differ, because I learned a lot more than they did because they abandoned the story when the building burned down. Now, of course, there were some who didn't abandon it quite as quickly as others, but in general, this represents a major failure of the press in our country. One of the prophecies that had been around Mount Carmel since 1934 called for an ultimate confrontation between God's people, or those at Mount Carmel, and the forces of an armed apostate power called Babylon. Perhaps with that in mind, in 1991, he began studying armaments and buying and selling guns. He pretty quickly found out there's a lot of money to be made at gun shows, and he and other people started going to gun shows. And they bought and sold. We now say, or the press now says, and most people say, they stockpile weapons. All gun dealers stockpile weapons. All gun shops stockpile weapons. We call those stockpiles an inventory.
How can one use firearms as an investment?
The guns that he was buying would go up in value, no question.
Okay. And do you know other people who do that?
Yes, sir.
It's not uncommon by itself,
No,
is
sir,
it?
not by far.
There was obviously, firearms that were there, and there were a lot of individuals that had their own firearms, and there were, quite an amount of firearms. But being in Texas, we had people come from the community out to our property and shoot with us on our firing range, and it was not really a big deal. I went to a couple gun shows before. I'm not an enthusiast at all, to say the least. But I went to a couple gun shows. I met some people, and some of our neighbors I would talk to had themselves. They had like 10 and 12 guns just in their little family. So I just kind of call it the good old boy syndrome, the good old boy, kind of mentality down in Texas, and it's a constitutional right. It's not, evil or demonized.
Did you state in your book at page 122 that you thought that the ATF was seeking to enforce unconstitutional firearms laws?
I found a scholar who studied the constitutional history of firearms laws and whose opinion is that they may not be constitutional. I was quite impressed to find out that that argument could be made and thought readers deserved a chance to see it.
Well, now that you've studied it and written and promoted it, what do you think now?
Whether or not they're constitutional?
Aren't you worried about that? Yeah, whether they're constitutional.
If the findings of these professors are trustworthy, that is a question to be litigated in the courts.
I understand. I mean, it's nice to write a book about what may or may not be constitutional and unconstitutional, but yet when you come here to testify, well, there's no question now that you've thought about it, this is not so unconstitutional as you would have thought. Now, just a moment. I didn't.
Mr. Chairman, I think it is incumbent upon all of us to extend courtesy to these witnesses, and I don't see what harm would result or ensue if the gentleman were allowed to explain perhaps a response he didn't get a chance to do.
I think we have to distinguish between illegality and constitutionality. Whether or not the arms laws are constitutional will be, at this point, the courts say they are. Tomorrow they may say different because of the research I cite in my book.
I've been very, very critical of the presentation earlier in this hearing of the victimization of Carrie Jewell, because as serious as child rape is, of course, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was conducting a firearms law investigation and search, and the issue of Mr. Koresh's depravity is not what they were investigating or going to serve a search warrant for. And I think that that testimony was put into this hearing to take newspaper headlines and other media attention away from a lot of the testimony about the law enforcement participation in the raid.
I'd like to just introduce the biographies of the panel. Dick Guerin is a widely recognized defense attorney in the state of Texas. He represented David Koresh and entered the compound during the siege. Would like to also introduce Mr. Jack Zimmerman, also a well-known and respected attorney. He represented Steve Snyder. He also gathered first-hand evidence upon entering the compound during the siege. In addition to being a defense attorney, Mr. Zimmerman is a colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. He practices as a military judge. Two very credible witnesses. Welcome.
You are saying, Mr. Guerin, I saw in David Koresh not a person who was insane, a person who was deeply committed and sincere about his religious beliefs. Well, I am sorry for you if that's what you see in him.
This was not a bunch of people who'd been hypnotized. These people that I saw, and I met almost everybody in there that died in that fire, these people believed. They believed in the Bible. Some people had been there as long as 40 years. Some people had been born and raised there. They were there because they believed in a vision of the Bible that was unusual. I don't understand it. And these scholars have a difficult time understanding it. But it was real. You can't legislate away that. In fact, the First Amendment says that we can't do anything about that.
Do you doubt the testimony of Kiri Jewell, who was here? Did you hear about that?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You doubt that?
Yes.
Do you doubt that, Mr.
Yes,
Zimmerman?
sir. Okay. Do you know why?
Yeah, you can tell me why.
That we didn't learn of that the first time when she testified for this hearing. She's made that kind of claim has been made for some time. Her own mother didn't believe that. Her own grandmother didn't believe that.
Right.
There's been doubts about prior contradictory statements that she's made in the past. Now, it may be 100% true.
Just
it may be 100%
my time because my time is up. In my judgment, in many ways, these witnesses are trying to simply deny things that just about everybody else accepts as fact about David Koresh.
And I'd like
We worked on that for a couple of years. In fact, we had the Department of Human Services go out and interview some of the kids and whatever they could do. I had people go out with them to interview. To this day, we don't have a case that we can make against Vernon Howell or anyone for child abuse. Even though the news media here and other people kept saying this is what happened. A man from Australia said this is what happened. But we could never get them to give us anything more than just, we know that's what happened. You have to have proof to go into court. Keep in mind, too, that most of the girls who were involved were at least 14 years old, and 14-year-olds get married with parental consent. So if their parents were there and letting things happen in the way of sexual activities and what have you with their 14-year-old kids, you have common law husbands and wives. I don't say that I agree with that and that I approve of it. But at the same time, if parents are there and they're giving parental consent, we have a problem with that and making a case.
Is when the fire did start and the fire trucks did arrive, I didn't let them in. I held them at the checkpoint because I didn't want the firemen to drive into gunfire. I just wasn't going to permit it. And it's a terrible thing, a very terrible decision to have to make. But I didn't hesitate. It took me that 2 seconds to make it. But we held the fire trucks. So that was our fire plan.
Most of the remaining Davidians were concentrated here in the kitchen dining room area. It was their only way out except for one thing. Two men outside were firing machine guns at them.
In the 51 days the FBI was involved, they did not fire a single shot. First, that would mean quite certainly that 27 of the people who died in the compound, I think the autopsy report showed 27, I may be off by one or two, who died of bullet wounds. Those were self-inflicted or inflicted by other members within the compound.
These are embers that are flying off the building, but you can see up in here that this is rapid gunfire. When we analyzed the tape, we found out that there's two people there in this area here. And they're firing for about 30 seconds in this area right here where we have the burning dining room area. And it's almost continuous gunfire. And towards the end of this particular section, we find out that the people doing the shooting are actually retreating away from the fire and shooting as they're retreating.
The machine gunning of the Davidians trapped in the burning kitchen dining room was not only visible to congressional investigators, it was even visible to home viewers. So was the gunfire behind the tank smashing into the rear of the gymnasium. Neither was mentioned despite the fact the FLIR tape shown to the Joint Committee had far better clarity than the copy used in this film.
You can see the thing real good from here.